A new podcast explores how a chance meeting at a Florida bar allowed a long haul trucker to infiltrate and ultimately defeat a violent terrorist organization. Joining us via video to tell us about it is Abdon Pallasch, co host of the podcast Underbelly, the Rebel Kind. Welcome, Abdon.
Great to be here, and thanks so much for having me on.
It's wonderful to have you, Abdon. And we should say the podcast was recently named a finalist for 3 Sunshine State Awards by the Society for Professional Journalism. So, first of all, congrats. That's great news. You
Thank you.
used to write for the Tampa Tribune here in Florida, back when it had that name, Chicago Tribune and Chicago Sun-Times more recently,
Yeah.
and now you work for the Illinois Office of the Comptroller. Um, Tell us a little bit about how you embarked on this project.
So, excuse me. This was a story that I started working on at the Chicago Sun-Times in the '90s. Excuse me. And w- you know, we I grew up in the Irish, community in Chicago. Before I, came down to Florida, and every year during wintertime in Chicago, I asked myself, why did I ever come back from Florida? Um, so we had heard, there's a fledgling peace process going on in Ireland in the '90s, and it's threatened by this breakaway faction of the IRA that wants to start the war going again to liberate all of Northern Ireland, reunite it with Ireland. And then we hear that the head of this militant offshoot of the IRA, Mickey McKevitt, has been arrested in Dublin and charged with directing terrorism. And the main witness against him is going to be a Chicago trucker named Dave Rupert. I'm like, who the heck is David Rupert? I know all the Irish people in Chicago. I've never heard of Dave Rupert. Um, and so I just, my colleague Bob Hergeth and I, start interviewing folks we know in the Irish community, saying, who is this Dave Rupert guy? And everyone in the group that was sympathetic to the militants, they all started downplaying their relation with Dave Rupert. Oh, he came in here and set up a few chairs at a couple of meetings, but he didn't really have much to. Oh, he was right in the middle of it. He was in the thick of it. And so our question was this a guy who came in as a mole to begin with, or was he a true believer who was turned or sold out? But there's no way to reach him. Dave Rupert, the Chicago trucker, the mole who's going to be the undoing of the real IRA, is in witness protection. We can't get at him.
Abdon,
And,
before you continue, let me just dial it back for one quick second because there's a lot of history I want to get to about the IRA and about Dave Rupert and kind of how he got involved. But I want to start with just sort of like, how did you first contact him? Because this podcast is actually based on recordings that you made like 2 decades ago.
yeah, the opportunity sort of fell into my lap. Um, as we're looking for Dave Rupert, who's in hiding, he is looking to have his story told. He's looking to have someone do his biography. And he happens upon my friend Flynn McRoberts, who has one of the most Irish names in Chicago journalism. He's writing for the Chicago Tribune at the time. And Flynn knows that I studied in Ireland. I was into this stuff. So he invites me to be part of this, book writing venture, writing about Rupert's life. And so we go to meet with Dave, and he wants to contract with someone to write his life. And I make it clear that if we do this, this is not going to be a hagiography. We are going to tell all Rupert's, his bankruptcies, his divorces, the whole warts and all story, and he's totally cool with that.
Is it
Because
true? Is it true that he contacted your co-worker or your co-author initially on this project, Flynn McRoberts, because he had the most Irish sounding name that he could find in Chicago journalism?
that's part of it. I mean, Flynn McRoberts, even though McRoberts is technically a Scottish name,
Okay.
Flynn's Irish. Um, but it was also, there was a connection where a lawyer that Rupert knew had a friend who knew both Flynn and me, but he liked the name, so that helped.
Okay. And so Flynn, who was at the Tribune, contacted you. You were at the Chicago Sun-Times. Eventually, Flynn had to kind of move on because he had another
Yes,
book project that he was working on. And so you brought on another colleague to join you on this project of interviewing um,
yeah,
Rupert, David
Bob
Rupert.
Burkett, yeah.
Okay.
And Bob and I we had written stories for the Sun Times about Rupert, about this whole dynamic of who is this Chicago guy who is going to be the undoing of the IRA, militant offshoot that was trying to take down the peace process.
It's an extraordinary instance. And I guess, we did mention that there's a Florida bar involved. I don't believe that you ever knew Dave Rupert in Florida, but it's a bar that you actually were a regular at for a while.
And I saw you had a picture up there of the old Harp and Thistle, which brought back great memories. Now that one that you've got there, that is a bar that there's so many fun parts of this whole story, but one is that the FBI, using your tax money and mine, paid Dave Rupert to open a bar on the Northern Ireland border to ingratiate himself with IRA types,
Uh-huh.
which is how part of this happened. But Dave liked hanging out in bars. He liked courting women, and so the Harp and Thistle, as I'm sure plenty of your listeners, when they've been down to the Tampa area in the '90s and early aughts, would have stopped into the Harp and Thistle. It was a great, fun Irish pub right on St. Pete Beach. I used to hang out there when I was writing for the Tampa Tribune, and I very well may have been there on the night that Dave Rupert picked up Linda Vaughn, which is what started this whole adventure.
And that was this fateful meeting. As you say, he was, I guess, a bit of a womanizer. He was married several times. He admitted that he broke up with one wife because he wanted to continue chasing women, not be hindered by a marriage. But
Yeah,
the woman that he met was actually a pretty well-known lobbyist in Tallahassee. So tell us a little bit about, who Linda Vaughn was and why her role was so central to him kind of becoming connected with Republican Irish activists.
yeah. Linda Vaughn was an amazing woman who I think is one of the undertold stories of Florida. She was a powerhouse lobbyist in Tallahassee. She is the reason you cannot smoke indoors in Florida. She helped pass that. She took on the big industry, took on the gun industry. She was the Brady campaign's person in Florida trying to pass what we now call common sense gun laws, what they then called gun control. Um, she passed the McBride Principles, which was saying that Florida companies could not invest in companies in Northern Ireland that discriminated against Catholics. She was very into Irish causes. She was also just before Dave met her. She was the Florida campaign manager for Paul Tsongas, who was trying to topple Bill Clinton in the '92 Democratic presidential primary. Bill Clinton eventually won that. But Linda Vaughn was very well known. When I approached the former Speaker of the House, Peter Rudy Wallace, he was Speaker when I was, covering politics for the Tampa Tribune back in the '90s. Um, and his law office, I said, do you remember Linda Vaughn? And he said, the red-haired tear? Are you kidding? Everyone in Tallahassee knew Linda Vaughn. Lars Hafner, who was former state rep, who represented the area that was included the Harp and Thistle pub. He was a regular at the pub, and he was the state rep representing the area. We met up at the old Harp and Thistle, which is now the Oyster Shucker on St. Pete Beach. And he recounted, working with Linda on legislation, that she was very aggressive, she came in, she had her facts straight, she would bowl you over, and she was a force to be reckoned with, he said.
And so she, in addition to being a powerful voice in Tallahassee and one that was sort of well remembered, she also became very involved in the cause in Ireland. She did some fundraising. She, according to her husband that you spoke to in your research, was the only
Mhm.
American invited onto this stage with the mothers of hunger strikers at this rally in the 80s that was, part of a major um, resistance movement against the British occupation of Northern Ireland or the British control of Northern Ireland. And so she was actually kind of a key figure. Well, I'll let you tell the story, but she would actually be responsible for passing messages to some
Yeah.
prisoners.
And I had not heard this in my earlier research when Bob and stories back in the '90s when this first came out. But so Linda's eventual husband, Kevin Magn, he was a Irish musician that she met after her time with Dave Rupert, and they married. They would play music for like Jimmy Carter's birthdays up in Georgia. So Kevin was a talented musician, pretty well known. um, he talked about how Linda would she would visit the prisoners in Ireland, IRA members who had been arrested and in prison, and they don't have much contact with their families. It's all very strictly controlled. So she would meet with their families, and they'd write little messages and fold it up on small pieces of paper and then put that in little bits of tinfoil. She would put them in her mouth. She would go to the prisons to meet with the political prisoners, give them a kiss, and pass the messages through her mouth to them that they could read later. So she was right in the middle of the armed struggle, the American Support Network. And if we take a step back here, America has been such a part of the whole Northern Ireland struggle. Britain invaded Ireland back in, a millennia ago, and occupied it for centuries, leading to a whole lot of, hard feelings on the part of the Irish that did not like being subjugated by the British. But for centuries now, the British moved into Northern Ireland, settled their people there. And when the rest of Ireland was able to win independence from Britain back in, the early uh, 20th century, um, the Northern Ireland stayed part of Britain. That was sort of the compromise that allowed them to end the War of Independence. But it was a rough go up there, especially starting in the 60s when the Catholics who wanted more rights, felt very oppressed by the British government there, started using the tactics of uh, the American civil rights movement to resist the British and seek independence. It was war back and forth. Um, and American supporters played a big role in that. In fundraising, the Irish would come here, and Irish Americans would do very well here in this country, in Florida and everywhere else, and they would send money back to what they thought was the noble cause of helping, free the Irish from Britain. It wasn't always noble, and that sometimes the money would go to the IRA that would use it for bombs. It would sometimes kill civilians. So it was uh, a very difficult struggle on both sides. Um, I'm probably going a little off the question you just asked about Linda Vaughn's role in it.
Well, she was a big fundraiser, as you say. I mean, there was a lot, especially in Chicago, in that area, people, families contributing to NORAID. And in fact, in the context of this podcast, you were able to, kind of explore some of your own family history. I mean, your mom is part of this podcast, right? You talked to her about her personal history, some of which was fairly traumatic.
So I've been raised, and there's some quote about one of the was it Queen Victoria? One of them say that the Irish get this resentment of the British and their mother's milk. Um, my mom would tell us stories. Really, my grandma told us stories about when my grandmother was a young girl, one of 16 kids growing up in rural, West Kerry in Ireland, and her uncle had been teaching Irish, to students, and that was forbidden. She said in those times that they were trying to stamp out the Irish language and have everyone speak English. And so she had to watch her uncle dragged to death. They got the kids out on the front porch and they tied half of them to a truck and dragged them down the street. So that does foster a hell of a lot of resentment.
Mm.
They say that the old joke about Irish holding a grudge is Irish Alzheimer's. You forget everything but a grudge.
Hmm.
So I was raised early on that the British are the enemy. We need to get them out of Ireland. They've been gotten out of 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland, but the six northeasternmost counties that formed Northern Ireland were still under British rule. Um, and when I was a kid, my mom would take us to picnics put on by NORAID, Irish Northern Aid, which was a group that raised money ostensibly to help the families of the Irish political prisoners, the IRA members imprisoned in Northern Ireland, but which the CIA and the Irish government say no, they're giving money to fund the military campaign of the IRA. So yeah, that was a part of my life growing up.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to Abdon Pallasch. He is the co-host of the podcast Underbelly, The Rebel Kind. We're talking about a podcast that just won a number of nominations from the Society of Professional Journalism. If you have questions or comments, you can join the conversation by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. So we're talking about the IRA broadly, Abdon, but the part of the IRA that David Rupert infiltrated was a very violent kind of subset or splinter group called the real IRA. They were sort of emerging as the country was moving, sort of with the help of the United States towards, a peace deal of some kind. The Good Friday Accords, which ultimately would kind of help, bring that long simmering and very brutal, conflict to an sort of an end. But there was people who didn't support the movement towards the Good Friday Accords, and the real IRA emerged as kind of one of the chief splinter groups that wanted to continue the fight.
Right. And the whole history of Irish resistance to British rule has been one of the British know if they can split the Irish amongst themselves and get them arguing with each other, it does their work for them. And so you'd have the Irish fighters who fought to get rid of Britain, but then they fight to a stalemate and they're willing to do a compromise. And those that don't want to compromise versus those that are willing to compromise, so they can get out of the war zones. That's been the history of the Irish struggle, and that happened when, in 1916, the deal that allowed it was a few years after, it was the early 1920s, the deal that allowed most of Ireland its freedom in exchange for leaving the six northeasternmost counties with Britain, divided the Irish between those who thought it was an acceptable compromise versus those who thought it was a sellout.
It sparked a
And like
civil war, right? I
it
mean, that
did,
was yeah.
The Wind That Shakes the Barley is a very brutal, a good movie to watch if you want a nice segment of that. Um, so in the 90s, you've got Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, who are the sort of the leaders of the IRA that are trying to bring it now from the militant approach to into the political realm. They're trying to convert it from a military movement to a political movement, the Sinn Féin party. And they're saying, we'll do the deal with the British. We agreed to lay down our arms, and they let our people out of prison, and then we run for office and we try to win independence for Northern Ireland through the ballot box, not through the bombs. And this is a tough sell with a lot of their members who had been fighting their whole life, and like, what did we fight and so many of our comrades die for, to now agree to be elected to the British Parliament. um, so the leader of one of these militant factions was Mickey McKevitt, and he started a group that came to be known as the Real IRA. But when Dave Rupert is getting involved with this, uh, at this point, these splinter groups are just starting to splinter off. You've got one called the Continuity IRA, and one of the guys that Dave Rupert meets up with is a pub owner in Bundoran in County Donegal, Joe O'Neill, he's a singer, he's a pub owner, and he's also on the side very involved in the Continuity IRA, one of the splinter groups. There's another guy, Vince Murray, who is in Sligo, which Linda Vaughan has arranged for Tallahassee and Sligo to be sister cities. So she goes over a lot and meets with Vince, and when she and Rupert start dating, she brings Rupert over there, and he starts meeting these pub owners and getting friendly with them, because he's an amiable guy. He's you know sort of happy-go-lucky trucker, and he's just dating Linda Vaughan. He's not Irish. He has no interest no vested interest in what's going on in Northern Ireland. But the pub owners find a captive audience, and they start trying to educate him on 800 years of Irish history and why he should be upset about the British presence in Northern Ireland.
And you say that Linda Vaughn kind of transferred this instant credibility because she was so involved in the cause in Ireland and kind of helping to raise money for Northern Ireland and all of these things that she was doing. So he was kind of immediately embraced and trusted, but he also, kind of in an almost offhand way endorsed this approach of violence and a conversation that he was having with some of these members of these, factional IRA groups, talking about the lessons of Vietnam. Can you kind of explain what it was that he was saying that persuaded them that he might be a true ally in their some very often violent cause?
And he had walked in on Linda Vaughan's arm, so it's immediately assumed that Dave Rupert's okay, that he's one of us, because Linda Vaughan is such a beloved Irish American supporter of the cause. So when these pub owners are expressing their frustrations of trying to get Britain out of Northern Ireland, and Dave Rupert says to them, "Well, it's just like it's like Vietnam. You're just not sending enough body bags home to England. That's how the Vietnamese won the war." And he really meant that as sort of just a statement of fact, as an observation. But they took that as an endorsement of their whole approach. They're like, oh, good, he's one of us. He became an instant local hero.
And so he begins hanging with through Linda with some of these pub owners, and really it was just kind of that incidental acquaintance that he was making that led to this the FBI essentially to approach him and ask him to spy on behalf of their organization and ultimately MI5, the British military intelligence organization. Um, they tell us, I mean, it was kind of someone snapped a picture of him with these Irish IRA members.
Yeah, he's hanging out with them, and the Garda, the Irish word for police is Garda. The Garda trucks go by, and Vincey Murray and Joe O'Neill both say, "Oh, look, they've got your picture now too." And Dave doesn't think anything of it. He breaks up with Linda. Dave tended to cycle through women. He's now been married to his wife Maureen for more than 30 years. They're very happy. But at that point in his life, he was cycling through women very quickly, and that's one of the ways he endeared himself to some of these guys, is telling them all the stories about his ex-wives, and they all find it very entertaining. This wealthy American who's able to have money to travel to Ireland, and all his ex-wives and what he. But he's back in his trucking office in Chicago a year later, and the FBI comes in, and he's wondering, what the heck does the FBI want with me? And he starts thinking of all the shady business deals he's done over his lifetime. Is this the $750,000 he owes to the IRS? Does this have anything to do with his brother's arrest for hauling a ton of marijuana through Florida and getting arrested, in Fort Lauderdale, and having to do 18 months at Okeechobee Correctional Center? All these things are running through his head. And then the FBI agent, Ed Buckley, slaps down these pictures of him with Vincey Murray and Joe O'Neill. And Rupert was relieved. He's like, oh, is that all? Those are just drinking buddies. And he didn't have any, ties to Ireland. He wasn't Irish. So O'Neill says to him, how'd you like to go to work for, I'm sorry, the FBI agent, Ed Buckley, says to him, how'd you like to go to work for us, spying on your friends? And he thinks about it a little bit, and he says, okay, if they're going to send me to Ireland, I enjoy going to Ireland. I can keep my ears open and pass information back to them. And that's how this whole thing started.
And he, thought about it because he wasn't, necessarily like a diehard, not necessarily a spy by nature. I mean, you describe him as kind of the opposite of James Bond physically in his
Yes.
appearance, kind of a giant of a man. But he became concerned that the cause was ending up, taking the lives of innocents, and not necessarily, purely focused on a liberation, but was actually, targeting people that were civilians in every way. And so he agrees to do this, spy measure. He goes and he eventually kind of persuades the FBI to essentially buy him a bar that he starts to run as cover.
And I encourage you all to listen to the podcast. You can find it on Spotify, on Apple, wherever you get your finer podcasts. Underbelly, the Rebel Kind. And it's deadly serious stuff, but there's always also so many fun stories. The whole idea of the FBI paying this trucker to open a pub in Ireland, just this side of the Northern Ireland border, that was frequented by a lot of Northern Irish IRA supporters who are coming and spending their holidays there. It's just, you don't picture James Bond, mopping up vomit off the bar floor, which is, this guy just had the everyday travails of trying to run a pub where a whole lot of heavy drinking IRA supporters are hanging out. And it's not so much politics as just keeping them from killing themselves.
Right.
it's there's some great funny stories. But the crazy thing about the scheme actually worked. You wouldn't have thought that a 6'7" Protestant would be able to fool the likes of Mickey McKevitt, the cunning leader of the real IRA, who's spent a lifetime being able to spot British spies coming. But Rupert is able to pull this off just through having a good knack as a storyteller, and having a way with people.
And he, ultimately became, as you call it, the FBI's secret weapon. At some point, his role as this undercover agent came to a head because while the FBI had one set of goals British intelligence had a sort of different set of goals. British intelligence essentially wanted him to kind of stay there and keep providing intelligence information for the long haul, but the FBI had kind of different aims.
The- he's able to move his way up to Mickey McKevitt, which the British never expected, because he's starts off on the west coast of Ireland there with these, like, Joe O'Neill is not really a powerhouse. He's with sort of the sleepier branch of the IRA militant breakaway factions. And so for Rupert to be able to parlay that into a meeting, and then eventually working his way up to be damn near the right hand man to Mickey McKevitt, because and part of it is Rupert becomes the bagman in good Chicago fashion, where he's infiltrated these IRA support groups in Chicago, and he says, "Well, I'm going to Ireland anyway. Let me bring the money over." You show up in Northern Ireland with bags full of American cash, they're happy to see you. So Mickey McKevitt is happy that this American is showing so much interest in the cause, and he really allows himself to be taken in by Rupert, to the point then that when Rupert begins to accumulate enough information, the various folks in the British, Irish, and U.S. government say, "Why don't we charge McKevitt and take him out of action?" The more cautious types say, "No, just stay there. This was only meant to be a surveillance operation," and that's all Rupert signed up for. He did not sign up to be in the spotlight testifying in court, but they eventually persuaded him, and part of that was the Omagh bomb, which we get into in the podcast in a big way. But that's when Mickey McKevitt and the Continuity IRA, both of them had a hand in it, but they set off a bomb in a picturesque little town of Omagh in Northern Ireland, in the downtown shopping district, where you got all these moms and kids shopping on a summer holiday for their school uniforms. And it goes off right in the middle and blows up 31 people, mostly women and children. And it really does turn public opinion in Ireland against these IRA militants. And it also helped persuade Rupert that, hey, it's worth taking the risk of testifying against McKevitt.
And we should say we're looking at a picture now for those who are watching our live stream of a photo that was taken just moments before the car bomb. There's a photo that shows the car that exploded moments later in Omaha that took the lives of 31 people. But there was no small risk to David Rupert either, as you talk about. I mean, there was very much the chance that if he was caught, he even says he was less worried about dying and more worried about I think he says, the 3 days of having my fingers cut off
Yeah,
beforehand, because he knew that the penalty for that kind of betrayal was incredibly severe.
he was playing with fire this whole time, and he, luckily for him, escaped with his life.
Well, it is a fascinating podcast. There is so much history to be discovered, and as you say, the trial and, kind of what the outcome of that Omagh bombing is also heavily covered in the podcast. But it's a 12-part, very riveting, and I encourage everybody to check it out. It's called Underbelly: The Rebel Kind. The co-host is Abdon Pallasch. Abdon, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
And thanks so much for having me on. Everybody give the podcast a try.
All right, thank you.